Have you ever woken up in the morning, reached out to the other side of the bed, and felt nothing but emptiness? The kind of emptiness that whispers to you, "They're gone." The chair at the dining table sits vacant. The sound of their laughter is no longer filling the room. And as the day turns into night, the silence grows louder, pressing on your chest like a weight you can't lift. This is the reality John faced after Mary, his wife and companion of 40 years, passed away unexpectedly. He often found himself asking, how do you keep living when half of your soul is missing? But amidst the pain and loneliness, John discovered something, a truth so profound that it reshaped his understanding of grief and loss. What was this truth? And how can it help you find peace in your own journey through life's most difficult moments? Before we dive deeper into the video, I'd truly appreciate it if you could subscribe to support our channel. Your support helps us grow and continue creating meaningful content. Thank you. Let's explore together. John and Mary's story began on a rainy afternoon in 1980, a moment so vivid in John's memory that even decades later, he could still recall every detail. Mary was wearing a bright yellow dress. Her umbrella had just flipped inside out from the wind, and she was laughing at her own misfortune. John, standing nearby, couldn't help but smile. He walked over, offered to share his umbrella, and in that small act of kindness, a lifetime of love began. They built a life together. Not a perfect one, but one filled with shared dreams, laughter, and resilience. They raised 2 children in a modest home, filled with the smell of Mary's cooking and the sound of John's favorite jazz records playing softly in the background. Their days were marked by simple joys: morning coffee on the porch, walks in the park hand in hand, and late-night conversations about everything and nothing. But like any couple, they had their challenges too. There were disagreements about finances, sleepless nights when their children were sick, and moments of doubt during tough times. Yet through it all, they had one unshakable tradition. Every night before bed, no matter how tired or upset they might be, they held hands until they fell asleep. That tradition lasted for 40 years, until one March morning, when it ended abruptly. John woke up to find Mary lying peacefully beside him. But something was wrong. Her hand was cold. She wasn't breathing. A stroke had taken her in her sleep, swiftly and without warning. In that moment, John's world shattered. The days that followed felt like a blur to John. Friends and family came by to offer condolences, but their words felt distant, like echoes in an empty house. The home he had shared with Mary for decades now felt foreign. The silence was deafening. He tried to keep himself busy with familiar routines, brewing 2 cups of coffee each morning, even though one would go untouched, watering Mary's favorite plants in the garden, and sitting at the dining table where her chair now sat empty. But these small acts only magnified her absence. At night, John found himself lying awake on a bed that felt far too big without her beside him. He would reach out instinctively to hold her hand, only to be met with cold sheets. One evening, as he sat alone in the living room flipping through an old photo album, John broke down. The pictures of their wedding day, family vacations at the beach, and quiet anniversaries celebrated at home were no longer just memories. They were painful reminders of what he had lost. He confided in his daughter. "I don't know how to go on without her. She wasn't just my wife. She was my best friend, my partner in everything. Without her, I feel like only half of me is left." His daughter listened quietly before saying something that stayed with him. "Dad, maybe you don't have to figure it all out right now. Maybe it's okay to just take it one day at a time." But even taking it one day at a time felt impossible for John. Every day seemed heavier than the last. Beautiful memories turned into sharp pangs of grief that pierced his heart over and over again. He began avoiding places they used to go together, the park bench where they'd sit during Sunday afternoons, the little cafe where they'd share slices of pie after church. Even listening to music felt unbearable because every song reminded him of Mary, humming along while cooking dinner. 6 months after Mary's passing, John decided it was time to clean out her closet, a task he had been avoiding for too long. As he opened the door and was greeted by the faint scent of her favorite lavender perfume, tears welled up in his eyes. Among her winter coats and scarves, he found something unexpected, a small envelope tucked into the pocket of her favorite coat. It was addressed simply, "To John, when I'm no longer here." With trembling hands and a heavy heart, he opened it. Inside was a letter, written in Mary's delicate handwriting. "My dearest John, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer by your side. I don't know when or how this will happen, but I know that one day, one of us will have to say goodbye. I've always worried about how you would cope without me. You love me so deeply that sometimes I feared it might make things harder for you if I left first. So I want you to know this. Our love doesn't end when my heart stops beating. It lives on in every moment you breathe and love, in every smile you give. Don't let your grief over me stop you from living your life fully. Cry when you need to, but laugh whenever you can too. Remember me with joy, not sadness. And always remember, true love never dies. It simply changes form. Forever yours, Mary." John read the letter over and over again, tears streaming down his face. Not tears of pain this time, but something deeper. It was as though Mary's words reached across time and space to comfort him, reminding him that their love was still alive in a different way. The letter didn't erase his grief or magically heal his pain, but it gave him something he hadn't felt in months. Hope, psychology, healing, understanding the depth of grief. Grief is not just an emotional response, it's a biological one, explains Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychologist specializing in grief and loss. When you lose someone you've loved deeply for decades, your brain doesn't just feel the absence, it physically reacts to it. This phenomenon is known as neurological coupling. Over time, our brains form deep neural pathways connected to our loved ones. Pathways that help us anticipate their presence, their touch, their voice. When they're suddenly gone, those pathways remain intact, but have no destination. It's like a song that starts playing, but never reaches its chorus. For John, this explained why he still found himself calling out Mary's name when something exciting happened, or instinctively reaching for her hand in the middle of the night. His brain was still wired for Mary's presence, even though she was no longer there. John's journey mirrored what psychologist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross famously described as the 5 stages of grief. Denial. In the first few days after Mary's passing, John couldn't accept the reality. Maybe the doctor was wrong, he thought. Maybe she's just in a deep sleep. Denial acted as a buffer, giving his mind time to process the shock. Anger. As reality set in, John felt anger bubbling up inside him. "Why her?" he asked. "We had plans to travel to Europe next year." His anger wasn't just directed at fate, but also at Mary for leaving him behind. Bargaining. In quieter moments, John found himself replaying the past and bargaining with what-ifs. If only I had noticed the signs earlier. If only I had taken her to more checkups. He blamed himself for not preventing the inevitable. Depression. This was when John felt at his lowest. The weight of Mary's absence became almost unbearable. He stopped eating regularly, struggled to sleep, and found little joy in activities he once loved. I don't see any reason to keep going, he admitted to his daughter one evening. Acceptance. Acceptance didn't mean John stopped missing Mary, or that his pain disappeared. Instead, it meant learning to coexist with his grief, to carry it as part of his journey, rather than letting it define him entirely. As Dr. Chen explains, grief doesn't shrink over time. We grow around it. John also experienced what researchers call the widowhood effect, a term used to describe the increased risk of health issues and even mortality following the loss of a spouse. Studies show that grief can weaken the immune system, disrupt sleep patterns, and even lead to conditions like broken heart syndrome, a real medical phenomenon where intense emotional stress mimics symptoms of a heart attack. For months, John struggled with these effects. He skipped meals, lost weight, and found himself waking up multiple times during the night with an overwhelming sense of emptiness. Losing Mary didn't just break my heart, John later reflected. It felt like it broke my entire body. But then something unexpected happened, a moment that began to shift everything for John. 2 years after Mary's passing, John was no longer the man crushed by sorrow. He still missed her every single day, still spoke to her in quiet moments, and sometimes he still cried. But he also laughed more often, loved more deeply, and lived more fully. John learned 3 profound lessons about grief and love that transformed his life. 1. Grief is a reflection of love. John came to understand that the pain he felt wasn't his enemy. It was proof of the deep love he and Mary shared. If I didn't love her so much, I wouldn't feel this way, he realized. Instead of running from grief, John embraced it as part of his journey. He began journaling his emotions, allowing himself to cry when needed, and even talking to Mary as if she were still listening. Grief isn't something you overcome, John shared. It's something you learn to carry with you. 2. Memories are gifts, not burdens. John started viewing memories differently, not as painful reminders, but as precious gifts that he was lucky to have received. He created a memory corner in his home with favorite photos and meaningful items from their life together. He shared stories about Mary with his grandchildren so they could know what an incredible woman she was. Every memory is proof that we lived a beautiful life together, he said. How could I be sad about that? 3. Love lives on through actions. The most important lesson John learned was how Mary's love could continue through his actions. He began volunteering at the hospital where Mary once worked, planting her favorite flowers in their garden, and taking trips they had planned together. Every time I do something good, John said with a smile, I feel like Mary is smiling down at me. A message for you. John's story reminds us that grief doesn't have to be the end of your story. It can be the beginning of a new chapter filled with meaning and purpose. If you're carrying pain in your heart right now, ask yourself, what does this pain say about the love I've experienced? And how can I honor that love moving forward? True healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering with joy instead of sadness. So what about you? What pain are you carrying? And can you see the love hidden within your grief? Share your story in the comments below, because sometimes sharing is the first step toward healing.